So part of my job here at Crossview, although not reflected in my job description, is to help Pastor Chris learn how to use his cell phone and computer. It helps that I'm quite tech savvy, but if you were to ask me how I know technology so well, I would have to say that it runs in the family. In fact, my grandmother is quite the cyber granny. I bet it would be safe to assume that your grandmother hasn't created a website, but mine has, all right? My grandmother has spent an immense amount of time, money, and energy in finding who our family's ancestors are. From breathing in dust into old record books to visiting complete strangers who supposedly had some family connection to her, my grandmother has figured out our family's genealogy all the way back to the late 1600s. And to share her hard findings, my grandmother created this website. It's a complete database that shares people and photos and stories of my ancestors. And pictured there is my great-great-great-grandfather, John Bechtold Jr. And now as I look through this website, I'm reminded of where I come from and the life my ancestors lived through, ultimately leading to where I am today. Their story is ultimately part of my story. Now, as I think about this website, it made me think about something else. My guess is there may be a great number of us here this morning who would not recognize this photo. See, back in 1889, a small group of believers followed God's leading and created the Swedish Mission Church of Mankato. And just a few years later, this church built that building on the corner of Ball Street and Belgrade. And don't bother looking up Ball Street on a map because it doesn't even exist anymore. So I spent a lot of time flipping through the pages of this book, our church's 100-year celebration from back in 1989. And by the way, I was only 2 years old at that time. But it was really interesting to look through this and see the Swedish Mission Church become the Evangelical Covenant Church and finally into Crossview Covenant. And in this book are many great significant stories. You can read that by faith in 1925, our church led a series of evangelistic gatherings, which led into a great number of people coming to know our Lord. By faith in 1926, our church supported Gertrude Olsen as she went to go reach the lost in Venezuela for 42 years. By faith in 1930, our church held its first vacation Bible school to share Jesus with the children of Mankato. By faith, in 1961, our congregation did not give up and rebuilt after our church at Carroll Court literally blew up. And since then, ministries have flourished, including a 5Cs, Awana, a youth ministry. Our church has increased in numbers, and eventually we outgrew holding our services in a gym, and we found ourselves a new home here at Howard Drive. Our church has grown over the past 120 years from 35 members to more than 600 family and friends worshiping on Sunday mornings with us. God has been busy here in Mankato and even in the life of our own congregation. Now, the reason why we walked down memory lane this morning is because with us on the verge of a new lead pastor, we naturally turn our attention to where we're going. What's next? Where will God lead us now? And while it's exciting to look to the future, we should never forget our past. The past reminds us of who we are and how we got to where we are today. Our history is a meaningful story of people and events that show the leading of God's purpose for us. And our story is but a part of God's story that expands all of time. And this is what we share with people, our story in the midst of God's story. And that was something that Israel did a lot of. Their story was so significant that all the nations continue to talk about their story today. And I want to visit their story this morning. So if you will, open up with me to Hebrews chapter 11. And while you're opening up to this passage, just a little background about this. We don't really know who wrote this letter. Many suggest it was Paul, but there's a plenty good amount of other candidates. But what we do know is that it was written about 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And it was written primarily to Jewish Christians, God's chosen people who recognized Jesus as the Messiah and chose to follow him. So as we read this, remember that the author is writing to people who should already know this story, but he's reminding them to remember the past. So let's dig in, starting at verse 1 of chapter 11. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. I'm going to pause here because the author is reminding us about faith. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Okay, so I could look at this chair in front of me, and I can see it and believe in its existence because I can see it there, and I can study it enough to know that this chair can support me. So through my eyes, at looking at this chair, I can have the assurance and ability of its existence just by looking at it. Now, faith is that for which we cannot see. So by faith, we can have confidence and assurance in God's existence and ability as if we're seeing it with our own eyes. By faith, we can understand the universe, that it was formed by God's hand. And as Pastor Chris shared a few weeks ago, he said the phrase, the more we know, the more we see. And I think this is getting to the heart of verse 3, because the more that we come to know the unseen power of the one who made the universe, because through faith, we are now looking for it. By faith, we can know that everything we see was created by the one we cannot see. And according to verse 2, this is what the heroes of the Old Testament were commended and admired for. They lived by faith in extraordinary ways which caught the attention of their descendants and many other nations for all generations. And this is their story. As we scan down verses 4 through 12, we hear about Abel's sacrifice and how he was commended as a righteous man. Enoch had a faith that pleased God so well that God took him straight to heaven without him experiencing death. By faith in a future event, Noah built his ark. By faith, God told Abraham to go, so he went, traveling hundreds and hundreds of miles to go live as strangers in a land that God promised him. And through Abraham came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore. But take a look at verse 13. It says this, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. These people lived by faith, but only got to see their promises from a distance. They didn't really get to enjoy what was promised to them. People like Abraham could have easily had enough of the expectations in front of them, causing them to look back at what their life was like before. Could have easily turned away from God and gone to their old life. But as verse 16 says, they longed for something better, something heavenly. Where God would be taking them would be far greater than anything they had ever known. And they saw it and they craved it. By faith, they did not live for themselves, but they were living for future generations. And God was not ashamed to be called their God. Their faith was so great that God would call them his own, and he loved every bit of it. But their story doesn't end here. As you continue on in verses 17 through 31, we read that by faith, Abraham was tested as he took his God-promised son to be sacrificed. We're reminded of the blessings passed down through Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. We see the faith of Moses' parents, soon to be the faith of Moses, as he took the people of Israel out of Egypt and brought them through the Red Sea. By faith, Jericho fell to Israel's march. By faith, Rahab the prostitute was saved. And as the author continues in verse 32, what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they may gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskin, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. Living by faith is not easy. These people who wandered around in deserts and mountains and dwelled in caves and holes in the ground lived by faith. And this is what they are remembered for. This is part of God's story that we share today. And it is part of our story too. Because of all these people who lived by faith, we have to go into chapter 12 because it says, therefore. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. Therefore, because of all these people who make up our faithful past, get rid of the sin that is entangling us. Do away with the thoughts and words and actions that hinder you from the life God is calling you to. If there's something that's holding you back in your faith, throw it off like dirty clothes and let us run with perseverance. And now, children, you could probably relate to this well, because every time I read about this passage about running with perseverance and our eyes fixed on Jesus, I'm reminded of recess back in elementary school. How many of you, recess was your favorite time of the day back in school? Raise your hand if that was you. Okay, it was mine too. I loved it. But I remember back in elementary school when the bell rang indicating that recess had begun, all the kids were running. This massive crowd of elementary kids were in a dead sprint as if they were Olympic runners. And all their eyes were fixed on the 4 swings on the playground. Okay. Ever notice there's never enough swings on a playground, by the way? But all these kids, every child was running as if they knew they would get that swing. Their eyes never looked to the sandbox to the left or to the monkey bars to the right. Their eyes were fixed straight ahead at the swings, and they were passionately running. So let us run like a child to the swings with perseverance, with confidence, longing for something better, something heavenly, with our eyes fixed on Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured that cross, willingly bearing its shame, but now sits at the right hand of God. This is the gospel. This is the good news. And this is the point where our story connects with Israel's story. And this is all but a part of God's story. It's all connected, and this is what we share with people. So as I close this morning, let us reflect on these stories by asking ourselves 3 questions. The first question, what's your story? And in this question, there are actually 3 other questions, because we all have a story filled with a past, a present, and a future. So ask yourself, where have you been? Where has God led you? This is your past. This is what God has done in your past. Next one is, what's moving in you? What's stirring in your heart right now that God is breaking or inspiring you for? This is your present. This is right now. What's God doing right now in your life? And finally, where are you heading? Where is God leading you to next? This is your future. All these questions encompass what is our personal story of what God has and is and will continue to do in our life. So what is your story? Second question, how does your story intersect with Crossview's story? Crossview is on the verge of a 125-year anniversary. This means that for 125 years, our church has been reaching the lost, young and old in this community around the world. God has and is and will continue to use Crossview. So where does your story intersect with Crossview's story? Where in your own personal story have you shared in the life and ministry of Crossview? Maybe it's how this church has impacted your own life, your own story. Or maybe you engaged in a ministry and you saw fruit flourish from it, and you just got to tell somebody what God did when you were there. How does your story intersect with Crossview's story? And finally, how does your story engage in God's story? As we read the Bible, we realize that it is a story yet to be finished. And every one of us has a part in this story. So how do the events in the Bible touch your life? Where can the by faith statements continue with your name next to it as God uses you to further his kingdom? Recognize that while it is but a very small part, your story is significant to God's story. So do you know his story enough to share it with others? And when you do, where does your story engage in God's story? At this pivotal moment, we are eagerly and anxiously looking ahead. So let us take time to look behind. Reflect on these questions and let them sink in. These are the stories we should be sharing. We share our story, which intersects with Crossview's story. That is only but a part of God's greater story. And this week, I want you to chew on these questions and be in prayer about who you should share these stories with. Because too often we have these stories and we never do anything with them. So who should you share these stories with? Maybe a family member, maybe a coworker, maybe a neighbor, a classmate, a friend. This is your challenge for the week, to share these stories. So go up to them and say, have I got a story to tell you? Next week, Pastor CJ is going to pick up right where I'm leaving off, in the present, at the good news of Hebrews 12 and where we're heading next. But until then, church, what's our story?